The vision of the Gurubsar about Netherlands want to apologize for the slavery in Suriname.
The Netherlands wants to apologize? To who? Apologies are only due to the first, second, and third generation black slaves and indigenous people who actually experienced slavery. They are all dead, but their descendants are also no longer alive. But the fourth generation, so the descendants of the third generation born from the 19th century, have no right to apologies. They did not suffer, because slavery had long been abolished. Furthermore, they have passed over to colonialism and hold the religious teachings of their former ruler in high esteem, thus they are bound by them. Since most Surinamese are more religious than the Pope, she must observe the grace of her God about forgiving and letting the past rest. After all, everything happens according to God's will, right? I would also like to note that slavery has been worked into the hands of whites by various African rogue tribes of which the anti-Black Pete activist Jerry Afriyie is a descendant. And when we talk about apologies, the Africans have to take the biggest part. Since the slaves were owned and honestly bought, people could do with property what they wanted. That the slaves experienced inhumanity among the Christians on the basis of property rights was pathetic, but who can be blamed for that? The Africans who supplied the slaves? The slave drivers? The VIC or the VOC were the Dutch royal family to whom the slave drivers and the aforementioned associations have paid taxes for centuries? Or the Bible? Or the Creoles, the half-blood children of the white slave owners who ferociously mistreated the black slaves on the plantations and who cruelly tortured, mutilated, and slaughtered the runaway slaves in the cruelest way? Many poop on the whites for being cruel during slavery, but it is known that the favored Creoles, to make white feet, presented the most heinous invention to the whites to punish the black slaves. Don't forget that the light-tinted Creoles, so the descendants who were born through the abuse of the white masters, were 50% descendants of the whites and 50% of the black generation. To this end, these Creoles were exempted by their slave masters by birth from the hard labor on the plantations. The mothers of this half-breed generation were very proud to live close to the house of their master and mistress. They also got a job in the white household and were completely provided with clothing as a reference to the traditional costume of their female boss, that is the so-called kato missi. These half-blood children felt superior to the rest of the slave population, some of whom were allowed to receive, albeit limited, schooling, and the rest were employed as coachmen, overseers, and bashap of the black slaves on the plantations. To this end, these Creoles wreaked havoc like wild beasts, for they were not inferior in cruelty to their white fathers. All the aforementioned criminals as well as those of the Dutch royal family are no longer alive. So it's done and in the past. And speaking of the Maroons, they were heroes, but after the peace treaty in 1760 that they concluded with the colonists, they were rewarded with guns, goods, etc. They also made a pact, among other things, that runaway slaves had to be extradited to their owners. For this, they received 10 to 50 guilders per slave. These Maroons were completely absorbed in colonialism. As a sign of dignity, they were given a top hat, a suit, and a stick. They were no better than the ones they initially fought. It became me, and the rest can suffocate. Even now. And speaking of slavery. When I look out my window in the morning I see men and women walking around on their way to work who are not always treated well by their bosses. Some people are lucky enough to have a good boss, but not everyone is so lucky. Look at the current rules set by the government, it's pure modern slavery what they hum with conditions and rules. You are no longer allowed to do anything, you are only allowed to do what they prescribe, and that is just slavery. Zwart Piet gone, fireworks will soon no longer be allowed, employees have fewer rights and the Dutch culture of the residents is also being systematically taken away from them. It is the government that does it because all the troubles come from there. And if one wants to talk about reparations, the Dutch government can already start paying the victims of the child benefit in the Netherlands. The return of the children placed out of the home to the family must also be fully compensated, as soon as possible, because those people are still in trouble. Instead of starting here in their own country, does the government dare to apologize about times long gone, when none of the victims and perpetrators are still alive? One should first put one's own household in order before looking at the neighbors. That is correct and testifies to a sense of responsibility, but not the other way around. The fact is that the enslaved natives, the so-called Indians, by the land thieves did not stand up for their rights at the time. They have not fought themselves free for any reason but resigned themselves to their fate. And the people that submit to their tyrants will lose more than life and property, then they will die out. And this has also happened. The indigenous generation that experienced slavery has died out due to its apathetic attitude. And because it later turned out that the original indigenous people were too weak for the heavy work on the plantations, it was then decided to bring black slaves to Suriname. At the same time, the remaining natives who had not yet been forced into slavery were left alone. And the descendants of those survivors, including the Kalinyas, Caribbean, the Loconos, Arawaks, living on the coastal strip, and the Aquario, Trio, and Wayana, now live under the yoke of the Surinamese neo-colonialists. It is worth mentioning, however, that a large group of these natives who have converted to Catholicism are currently crying tears for land allocation and are currently experiencing backwardness and humiliations by the Surinamese government and so on. So, neither the original inhabitants of Suriname nor its descendants have ever been taken seriously. Not then and not today. These indigenous people want change without sacrifice and peace without struggle, but that's not how the world works. And as far as the current Surinamese are concerned, they place themselves in a victim role at all times. Oh, how pathetic they are. Written by a Surinamese from times gone by.